Elias McCall, a weathered ex-soldier, stands in a car auction, mocked by a cocky crowd for his worn boots and faded military jacket. He's there to bid on a Silverado to continue his late son Nathan's mission of delivering food to forgotten veterans. As the bidding surpasses his savings, the ground rumbles. A black SUV with government plates, flanked by Humvees, arrives. A three-star general steps out, saluting Elias, silencing the jeers. Who is Elias really? What secrets does his past hold? The crowd watches, stunned, as the truth begins to unfold, promising to change the town forever. If Elias McCall's story of quiet heroism moved you, join us in keeping these tales alive. Like, subscribe, and share to honor unsung heroes. Comment your own stories of service below. Support our channel to discover more inspiring stories of honor and purpose. Let's keep the legacy going. The sharp sting of mockery cut through the dusty air of the car auction, where gleaming vehicles stood like trophies under the midday sun. Old man, you lost. This is a car auction, not a retirement home. The jeer, laced with cruel amusement, came from a young man in a slick jacket, his voice carrying over the crowd. Laughter erupted, a chorus of derision that followed Elias McCall as he shuffled past a row of polished trucks, his faded military jacket hanging loosely on his wiry frame, his boots caked with the stubborn mud of his farm. The weight of their scorn pressed against him, but Elias didn't flinch. His weathered face, etched with lines carved by decades of hardship, remained impassive. He didn't need to answer their taunts. Words were cheap, and he'd long since learned to let actions speak louder. Then the ground rumbled. A low, mechanical growl silenced the crowd as a black SUV with sleek government plates rolled into the lot, flanked by two military Humvees, their tires kicking up clouds of dust. The laughter died as quickly as it had begun. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the air grew thick with unease. From the SUV emerged a general, his uniform crisp and heavy with metals that glinted in the sunlight. He moved with purpose, his boots striking the ground with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime commanding respect. The crowd parted like water before him, their phones slipping from their hands, forgotten. He didn't spare a glance for anyone else. His path was singular, unwavering, leading straight to Elias. The general stopped, stood at attention, and raised his hand in a sharp salute. Gasps rippled through the yard, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. No one laughed now. What unfolded next would ripple through the town, a seismic shift that would leave its mark forever. At 68, Elias McCall was a man who carried his years like a heavy rucksack, each one packed with memories he'd rather not unpack. Long before the dust of the auction yard clung to his boots, he had walked far more perilous paths, through hostile deserts, shadow jungles, and war-torn cities where danger lurked in every corner. He'd been a soldier, not just any soldier, but a special forces operator, the kind who moved through missions so classified they existed only as whispers in government vaults. His records, if they still existed, were buried deep, sealed away in archives no civilian could touch. To the townsfolk, he was just an old farmer, his skin toughened by sun and wind, his hands calloused from years of toil. That was how he preferred it. Elias had no use for glory. The war had already claimed too much. Friends who never came home, years he'd never get back, and pieces of his soul he'd left scattered across foreign soil. When he walked away from the army after 2 decades of service, he didn't chase medals or write books to trumpet his deeds. He vanished into a quieter life, buying a modest plot of land on the edge of town. There he built something simple, something real, a life of growing vegetables, tending chickens, and fixing whatever broke. Most importantly, he raised a son, Nathan. Nathan McCall had his father's piercing blue eyes, but his heart belonged to his mother, soft and generous, brimming with an idealism that refused to be dimmed. He didn't follow Elias into the crucible of combat, choosing instead a different kind of service. As a civil affairs officer, Nathan carried no rifle through the streets of Fallujah. His weapons were seed packets, soil testing kits, and notebooks filled with meticulous crop rotation plans. While other soldiers cleared roads of threats, Nathan built bridges of trust, working shoulder to shoulder with farmers in war-ravaged villages. Under the constant shadow of gunfire, he helped them coax life from barren soil, believing with unwavering conviction that food could heal what bombs had shattered. His work wasn't just about survival. It was about hope, about planting seeds that could outlast the chaos. And he was right, until the day an IED ripped through his convoy during a routine supply run. The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, relentless drizzle that seemed to mirror the weight of the news. Elias was in his kitchen, the scent of coffee still lingering, when the phone rang. Nathan was gone. They sent a folded flag and a letter filled with formal condolences, but no words could fill the void that opened in Elias's chest. Grief hit like a grenade, its blast loud and violent, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. For weeks, Elias didn't speak. The world felt muted, as if sound itself had been stolen. For months, he couldn't bear to open the door to Nathan's old room, where his son's childhood lingered in the form of faded posters and a well-worn baseball glove. The pain was a living thing, clawing at him in the quiet moments, whispering that he'd failed to protect the one person who mattered most. One day, while clearing out the garage, Elias found a notebook tucked among old tools and dusty crates. It was Nathan's, filled with handwritten delivery routes, drop-off points, and names of people he'd helped. Scrawled in the margins were personal notes. Ask Mrs. Carter about her hip. Leave extra tomatoes for Mr. Jones, he loves them. It wasn't just a logbook, it was a testament to Nathan's heart, a record of a mission that went beyond food. It was a lifeline, a quiet act of love woven into every delivery. Elias sat on his porch that evening, clutching the notebook as the sun sank below the horizon, its pages heavy with the weight of his son's kindness. The grief was still there, but something effaced his son's purpose. As the sky darkened, a resolve hardened within him. He would carry on Nathan's work. Every Saturday since, Elias loaded his old Ford pickup with crates of fresh produce and drove Nathan's routes. He delivered vegetables to elderly veterans, shut-ins, and forgotten families. His knocks soft, his words few but kind. No payment, no recognition, just a bag of food in a fleeting moment of connection. In those moments, Elias felt Nathan's presence, a quiet echo of his son's voice in every delivery. The truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a monument to a vow, a promise to keep Nathan's light alive. For Elias, each crate was a prayer, each delivery a step toward redemption, a way to hold on to the son he'd lost and the purpose he'd found. The old delivery truck had died a month ago, its engine locked up and its frame corroded beyond repair. For Elias McCall, the loss was a knife twisted in an old wound, as raw as the day he'd lost Nathan. That truck wasn't just a tool, it was a lifeline, a rolling testament to promises forged in love and duty. Its breakdown felt like a betrayal, not of mechanics but of memory. Yet Elias refused to break. He sold his tools, each one a piece of his livelihood, a quiet sacrifice that stung like parting with old friends. He cut every corner, skipped meals, and let bills pile up, scraping together just enough for a bid at the auction. He marked the date on his faded kitchen calendar, not with hope, but with resolve. People depended on him. A promise was a chain, binding him to those who waited. Now, in the auction yard under a sun that burned like judgment, Elias stood unbowed. He didn't think of his own pride or the weight of eyes on him. His mind was with Mrs. Keller alone in her small house, her Saturday deliveries a ritual that tethered her to the world. He thought of Nathan, whose words still guided him. Sometimes the delivery's just a reason to see if they're still okay. And he thought of the Silverado, its chipped white paint and dusty tires holding more than cargo. It held love, stubborn and enduring. The yard buzzed with the arrogance of men flush with cash. Polished boots stirred the dust, their owners swapping boasts and sealing deals with firm handshakes. Young contractors prowled the lot, their mirrored sunglasses and blinking earpieces marking them as men who never doubted their place. To them, pickup trucks were more than utility. They were status, emblems of triumph to be flaunted in pristine driveways. In this sea of swagger, Elias was a stranger, a relic from a quieter tale. His clothes carried the grime of hard days, his boots worn thin by years of walking. His army jacket, patched and sun-bleached from a war long past, draped loosely over his wiry frame. He wore it not for show or memory, but because it was a piece of him, a shield against a world that had grown loud and unfamiliar. He moved with purpose, consulting a battered notebook from his pocket. Its pages were filled with his meticulous notes, engine types, towing limits, mileage estimates, and potential faults, penned in the stillness of late nights under a flickering bulb. His money was scarce, and every cent had to pull its weight. He stopped before a 2010 Chevrolet Silverado, unadorned and unpretentious. Its white paint was scuffed, with rust creeping along the wheel wells, but its frame stood strong. Elias traced a rough hand along the truck bed, feeling for imperfections, seeking truth in its scars. His fingers, hardened by decades of toil, read the metal like a book, better than any mechanic's gauge. This truck wasn't flashy, but it was real. It could bear the burden of his promises. A burst of laughter interrupted his thoughts. "Look at Grandpa, shopping for his time machine," a voice mocked. "Probably brought Confederate dollars or war bonds." The jeers grew sharper, closer. Elias didn't turn. The voice was Tyler's, a young man, maybe 22, with slicked hair and aviators that screamed confidence. Tyler held up his phone, recording with a grin. "Y'all see this? Gramps thinks he's outbidding us with his pension." His friends laughed, egging him on. Elias stood unmoved, his gaze fixed on the Silverado. He opened his notebook, reviewing his numbers. $8,500, his entire world in a bank letter. He'd pour it all into this truck if it meant honoring Nathan's promise. An auction assistant approached, clipboard clutched tightly, his face a mask of professionalism tinged with doubt. He scanned Elias, noting the faded jacket, the lined face. "Sir, are you here to bid?" he asked, his voice polite, but heavy with the assumption that Elias was out of place. Elias looked him square in the eye. "I am," he said, his tone firm as he handed over his registration and bank letter. The assistant skimmed the papers, his skepticism lingering like a shadow. Elias didn't mind. His heart was elsewhere, with the Silverado, with Mrs. Keller, with Nathan's memory. The yard could mock him, could film their cruel jests. It changed nothing. He was here for a promise, and he'd keep it, no matter the etched. Elias McCall settled onto the weathered bench at the edge of the auction yard, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical, as if each step was a ritual etched into his bones. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and dust, and the hum of the crowd buzzed like a distant swarm. He ignored the sidelong glances, the hushed murmurs that trailed him like shadows, and the occasional smirk from a passerby who sized him up and found him wanting. Those judgments didn't touch him anymore. They couldn't. Not after everything he'd carried, everything he'd lost. His spine remained rigid, his shoulders squared, a soldier's posture that refused to soften, even years after the last orders were given. He unscrewed the cap of his thermos, the faint scrape of metal against metal grounding him, and took a slow sip of water. The cool liquid slid down his throat, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest, a knot that had been there so long it felt like part of him. His eyes drifted to Lot 47, the Silverado, parked among a row of vehicles gleaming under the midday sun. It wasn't just a truck to him. It was a promise, a tether to something he couldn't let go of. His fingers, calloused and steady, brushed the corner of the small green notebook tucked into his breast pocket. The motion was unconscious, a habit born in a time when every detail had to be recorded, every moment accounted for under skies that offered no mercy. The notebook's edges were frayed, its color faded, but it held more than memories. It held proof of who he'd been, who he still was, even if the world had forgotten. In that same pocket, pressed against the notebook, was a photograph, its edges softened by time and touch. Nathan's face stared back from it, young and unbroken, his smile wide under the Iraqi sun. He stood beside a modest garden, one he'd helped local farmers coax from the stubborn earth. On the back, in Nathan's careful handwriting, were words that had become Elias's anchor. "It matters, Dad. Even if it's small, it matters." Elias's throat tightened as he thought of it, his gaze still locked on the Silverado. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for Nathan, for the things that still mattered, even if they seemed small to everyone else. A few yards away, Harlan Reed sat on another bench, his broad frame still commanding, despite the years that had etched lines into his face. The retired Army Sergeant Major hadn't spoken a word, but his eyes had been fixed on Elias for the better part of 10 minutes. There was something about the man that tugged at Harlan's instincts, honed by decades of service. It wasn't just the way Elias moved, precise, controlled, like he was still navigating a battlefield. It wasn't the way he scanned the trucks, his gaze sharp and assessing, missing nothing. It was the absence of vanity in him, the way he wore that faded uniform jacket not as a badge of pride but as a second skin, something he couldn't shed even if he wanted to. Harlan's chest stirred with a memory he couldn't quite place, a flicker of recognition that grew stronger the longer he watched. Then he saw it, the small green notebook peeking from Elias's pocket. Faded, unassuming but unmistakable. Harlan's breath caught. Every man who'd served in Operation Prairie Ghost had carried one just like it. Those notebooks weren't sold in stores. They were earned, paid for in sweat, blood, and secrets that never left the desert. Harlan's heart thudded as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just any man. This was someone who'd walked the same shadowed paths he had. Harlan stood, his movements slow but purposeful, and pulled out his phone. He stepped away from the crowd, weaving through the chaos of the auction yard until he found a quieter corner near the restrooms, where the cell signal was strong and prying eyes were scarce. His hands, steady despite the weight of years, moved with the precision of muscle memory as he punched in a string of numbers, an old contact protocol few civilians would recognize, let alone know how to use. The line connected, and Harlan's voice was calm but laced with urgency. "This is Sergeant Major Reed, authorization code Charlie Tango 7. I need to speak with General Samuel Whitaker. Immediately. Tell him it's about Elias McCall." There was a pause on the other end, a faint crackle of static, before a sharp professional voice responded. "Stand by, sir." Harlan's jaw tightened as he waited, his eyes scanning the horizon where the rumble of approaching engines began to echo across the fairgrounds. Something was stirring, something bigger than the auction. And for the first time that day, Elias McCall wasn't as alone as he thought. Back at the bench, Elias remained still, his gaze unwavering, as Lot 47 drew closer to its turn on the block. The crowd's chatter had faded to a dull hum in his ears, drowned out by the weight of his own thoughts. The whispers from onlookers, the occasional stare, they barely registered anymore. He'd learned long ago to let those things slide off him like rain on a tarp. But the ache in his chest, the one tied to Nathan's photograph and the words scrawled on its back, that didn't fade. It grew sharper with every passing minute, a reminder of why he was here, why he couldn't walk away. His fingers traced the notebook again, and for a moment he was back in the desert, under a sky that burned red at dusk, surrounded by men who'd become brothers, men who'd trusted him, men he'd failed to bring home. He pushed the thought down, forcing his focus back to the Silverado. It was close now, only a few vehicles away. He could almost feel the keys in his hand, the weight of a promise kept. Hundreds of miles away, in an unmarked office at a military installation, a phone rang. Lieutenant General Samuel Whitaker, a man whose presence filled a room even at 60, picked up the receiver. His graying temples caught the light as he leaned forward, his sharp jawline set. When he heard Harlan's voice in the name, Elias McCall, he rose from his desk almost instinctively, his hand tightening around the phone. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. Harlan didn't hesitate. "No doubt in my mind, Sam. The jacket, the notebook, and something about his eyes. That man's carried ghosts longer than most of us have been retired." Whitaker turned to the window, his gaze distant, seeing not the manicured lawn outside but a desert horizon from decades past. He was silent for a moment, the weight of Harlan's words settling over him. "We thought he was dead," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Most legends are." The line went quiet, but the air in the room felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Whitaker's mind raced, pulling up memories of a man who'd walked through fire and vanished without a trace. Elias McCall, a name that carried more than a reputation. It carried a debt. At the auction yard, the wind picked up, carrying the distant growl of engines and the sharp calls of the auctioneer. Elias's eyes stayed on the Silverado, but something in the air felt different now. Heavier. He couldn't place it, but for the first time all day, the weight on his shoulders didn't feel quite so crushing. Harlan Reed, still standing in the quiet corner by the restrooms, slipped his phone back into his pocket. His eyes found Elias across the yard, and a flicker of resolve passed over his face. Whatever was coming, it was already in motion. And Elias McCall, whether he knew it or not, was no longer alone. The air hung heavy with anticipation, a quiet so thick it seemed to press against Elias McCall's chest as he stood under the fading sunlight. His calloused fingers tightened around the creased photograph in his pocket, its edges worn from years of handling. The image was a tether to a life that felt both distant and achingly close. A snapshot of him and his late wife, Clara, standing proudly beside their 2010 Chevy Silverado, Lot 47. That truck wasn't just metal and rubber. It was a vessel of memories, of dusty back roads, shared laughter, and quiet drives under starlit skies. Losing it today would feel like losing her all over again. Elias's jaw clenched, his heart a steady drumbeat of resolve. He wasn't here to let it slip away without a fight. Less than an hour ago, General Whitaker's voice had crackled through the phone, firm and unyielding. "Text me your coordinates. I'll be there within the hour." No questions, no hesitation. The general didn't bother with formalities like requesting clearance or alerting the press. Instead, he summoned a convoy with the quiet authority of a man who knew the weight of his words. Now, as Elias stood at the county fairgrounds, unaware of the forces mobilizing for him, the general's order was already in motion. A black SUV with government plates gleamed, freshly cleaned and fueled, flanked by two desert-tan Humvees pulled from the motor pool. The soldiers inside, young but disciplined, exchanged no curious glances. They knew better than to question Whitaker's commands, especially when his voice carried that rare, solemn edge, a tone reserved for moments that mattered. "Where to, sir?" the driver had asked, hands steady on the wheel. Whitaker glanced at his watch, his face etched with purpose. "County fairgrounds, step on it." The vehicles roared onto the highway, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like a warning. Other drivers slowed instinctively, sensing the gravity of the motorcade. This wasn't a routine escort. This was something bigger. Back at the auction, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. The auctioneer's voice droned on, a rhythmic chant that rolled from one vehicle to the next, each sold to dealers and contractors with swift efficiency. Lot 46, a sleek SUV impractical for farm life, rolled forward. But Elias barely registered it. His eyes were locked on Lot 47, the Silverado, still parked under a weathered canopy. Its familiar silhouette stirred a pang in his chest. Pride, grief, and stubborn determination all tangled together. He could almost hear Clara's voice teasing him about his stubborn streak, her laughter echoing in the cab of that truck. His fingers brushed the photograph again, grounding him. He wasn't just bidding for a vehicle, he was fighting to hold on to the man he'd been with her. Nearby, Tyler and his friends lounged against the fence, their smirks sharp and mocking. "Look at him," Tyler whispered, nudging his buddy. "Old man actually thinks he's going to win it." Their laughter was loud, careless, their phones already out, cameras trained on Elias like he was some sideshow. They didn't know the weight of the moment, the history woven into that truck. To them, Elias was just a weathered farmer in scuffed boots, out of place among the polished dealers. But across the yard, Harlan Reed stood apart, his arms crossed tightly, his gaze fixed not on the auction, but on the horizon. Harlan, a man of few words and keen instincts, had heard it first, a low, unmistakable rumble growing closer. Engines, heavy ones. His weathered face tightened with something like hope. Whatever was coming, it wasn't ordinary. Elias rose from his bench, his back stiff from sitting too long. He stretched slowly, feeling the ache of years spent working the land, then walked toward the Silverado as it finally rolled into position. Each step was deliberate, a quiet declaration of intent. He didn't care about the whispers or the smirks. This was his stand, his last chance to reclaim a piece of his past. The auctioneer adjusted his mic with a theatrical flourish, his voice booming. "Next up, Lot 47, a 2010 Chevy Silverado, 110,000 miles, clean title, minor cosmetic wear, but a strong engine. Starting bid at $6,000. Do I hear 6? Silence hung for a heartbeat. Then from the side of the yard, Elias raised his paddle, his hand steady. his eyes unyielding. 6, he called, his voice calm but resolute. No fanfare, no glance at the crowd, just a man staking his claim. The auctioneer nodded, his rhythm quickening. 6,000! Do I hear 6,500? A man in a crisp button-down shirt and mirrored sunglasses raised his paddle with a casual flick, his posture oozing confidence. 6,500, he said, barely looking up. Elias didn't pause. He lifted his paddle again, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. 7. A ripple of surprise passed through the onlookers. Heads turned, conversations hushed. Tyler and his friends exchanged smirks, their cameras still rolling, but their laughter faltered slightly. They'd expected Elias to fold early, but the old man wasn't backing down. 7,500, the auctioneer prompted, his tone eager now. Another bidder called out, and Elias raised his paddle again, his face a mask of quiet resolve. 8, the crowd stirred, sensing the tension. This wasn't just an auction anymore, it was a battle. Elias, with his worn boots and weathered hands, was holding his ground against men with deeper pockets and no stake in the truck story. The auctioneer's voice rose, almost gleeful. 8,500! Elias raised his paddle one last time, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he still held dear. 8,500! It was his limit. Every dollar he'd scraped together, every penny of his savings down to the last cent. He'd sold his tools, his livestock, even the last of his furniture, all for this moment. The auctioneer paused, caught off guard by his tenacity. The old man, Elias's heart thundered, but his face remained stoic, unreadable. Do I hear 9,000? The auctioneer called, his voice now charged with excitement. The man in the button-down shirt raised his paddle lazily. 9, he said, his tone almost dismissive. The crowd exhaled, the tension spiking. 9,000. Do I hear 9,500? Elias didn't move. His paddle lowered slowly, his fingers tightening around it until his knuckles whitened. He'd hit his limit, and the reality of it felt like a punch to his chest. He'd fought as hard as he could, but the wall was too high, too steep. He stared at the Silverado, its familiar scratches and dents blurring slightly as he blinked back the sting in his eyes. Clara's laughter seemed to fade a little further away. From the edge of the lot, Harlan Reed watched it all, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. The slump in Elias's shoulders, the smug grins across the yard, the auctioneer's fevered pitch. Harlan's gaze flicked to the road again, where the rumble of engines was now unmistakable, a growing roar that turned heads across the lot. Something was coming. And for Harlan Reed, for Elias McCall, for everyone in that dusty fairground, the world was about to shift. The general was almost here, and with him came a reminder of who Elias McCall truly was, a man whose story was far bigger than this auction, this moment, or the mocking crowd around him. The veteran's forehead creased with lines carved deep by years of hard choices and harder battles. He'd witnessed Elias McCall stand unyielding through the chaos of gunfire and the treachery of ambushes in distant lands, his resolve as steady as the earth itself. But now, watching Elias lower that auction paddle, the gesture carried a weight that felt heavier than any defeat. It wasn't just the loss of a bid, it was the quiet relinquishment of something intangible, something sacred. The veteran's chest tightened, a pang of empathy mingling with respect for a man who bore his burdens with such unspoken dignity. Harlan's phone vibrated in his pocket, a sharp interruption to the moment. He glanced at the screen where a message glowed briefly. ETA 2 minutes. A grim smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not one of joy, but of anticipation, as if he knew something the rest of the crowd couldn't yet fathom. Without a word, he turned and strode toward the front gate, his boots crunching against the gravel with purpose, his silhouette fading into the late afternoon haze. Inside the auction ring, the fervor over the Silverado was winding down, the bids trickling to a halt like a stream running dry. 9,000, going once, the auctioneer's voice boomed, clipped and mechanical, as if he sensed the crowd's attention drifting. Elias, seated on a weathered bench at the edge of the circle, turned his head slowly, his gaze lingering on the spot he'd just left. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, carrying no trace of resentment. Disappointment flickered in his eyes, yes, a quiet acknowledgement of a hope slipping through his fingers, but there was no shame. Elias McCall had faced far worse than losing a truck at auction, and the weight of those trials had forged in him a resilience that no fleeting setback could tarnish. "Going twice," the auctioneer called, his words hanging in the air unanswered. Then it began, a low rumbling growl, faint at first, like the stirring of a distant storm. The sound grew, steady and unrelenting, until the ground beneath the fairgrounds trembled ever so slightly. A pulse felt through the soles of shoes. Heads turned one by one, curiosity peaking as the noise swelled. First a few, then more, until every eye in the crowd was drawn to the main road. From the horizon, a black SUV emerged, its government plates unmistakable, its tinted windows reflecting the fading sunlight like polished obsidian. Behind it rolled two desert-tan Humvees, their tires kicking up clouds of dust as they moved in lockstep, a tight, disciplined formation. The convoy carved its path through the gravel, advancing toward the auction gates with an air of inevitability. The chatter in the crowd died mid-sentence, replaced by a stunned hush. Phones that had been raised to capture moments of ridicule now froze in mid-air, their owners gripped by a mix of confusion and awe. "What the hell is this?" a man near the back muttered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of engines. Tyler, a young spectator who'd been recording the auction with a smirk, lowered his phone, the smugness draining from his face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The auctioneer's voice faltered, his microphone still live but his words swallowed by the weight of the moment. The SUV glided to a deliberate stop just beyond the bidding circle, flanked by the Humvees, which parked with geometric precision on either side. For a long, suspended moment, the scene held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. Then the rear door of the SUV swung open, and from its shadowed interior stepped a figure that commanded immediate attention. Tall and imposing, the man wore a full military dress uniform, his chest adorned with a cascade of medals that gleamed under the sun. His posture was unyielding, as if forged from steel, and the three-star insignia on his shoulder marked him as a lieutenant general. He said nothing, his presence alone enough to still the air. His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and purposeful, before locking onto Elias McCall with an intensity that seemed to bridge years and battlefields in a single glance. The general's hand rose to his brow in a salute, executed with the crisp precision of a man who'd lived by the code of honor. It was a gesture not for show, but for recognition, a tribute to a man the crowd had overlooked. The fairgrounds fell into a silence so profound that even the soft breeze felt like an intrusion. Elias, standing near the bench, turned slowly, his brow knitting in disbelief. Was his mind playing tricks? The man before him was unmistakable. General Samuel Whitaker, resplendent in his dress uniform, the rows of ribbons and stars catching the light like a constellation of valor. But it wasn't the medals that hushed the onlookers. It was the salute itself, sharp, deliberate, and deeply personal, a silent acknowledgement of a shared history that transcended words. Elias's body reacted before his mind could catch up, his spine straightening instinctively, his shoulders squaring as if summoned by duty. He raised his weathered hand in return, the motion slow but graceful, guided by muscle memory honed through years of service. Their eyes met, two men bound by the unspoken weight of war, carrying stories etched in scars and silences that no civilian could ever fully grasp. In that moment, the auction, the crowd, the Silverado, all of it faded into insignificance. "Master Sergeant Elias McCall," General Whitaker's voice rang out, firm yet warm, cutting through the stillness with authority. "Permission to approach." "Granted," Elias replied, his voice low, steady, grounded in a quiet strength that carried the weight of a lifetime. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he added, "But drop the formalities, Sam. We've seen too much for that." The two men closed the distance between them, their handshake firm and unyielding, evolving into a brief, powerful embrace, the kind shared only by those who've stood shoulder to shoulder in the crucible of conflict. It was a moment raw with unspoken understanding, a connection forged in the fires of battles long past. Around them, the crowd began to stir, murmurs rippling through the onlookers like waves. Phones reappeared, but their purpose had shifted. No longer tools of mockery, They now captured a moment of reverence, a scene that demanded to be remembered. Tyler, his earlier bravado forgotten, raised his phone again, his fingers trembling slightly as he recorded. His expression one of quiet awe. The auctioneer remained silent, his microphone forgotten, as the fairgrounds bore witness to a truth that had been there all along. Elias McCall was a man worth honoring, and no bid could measure his worth. The phone in Tyler's hand trembled slightly, its camera still rolling, capturing a moment that had spiraled far beyond his initial intent. He'd come to the auction yard to record something trivial, maybe even poke fun at the rusty old Silverado on the block. But now he stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and shame. The air around him felt heavier, charged with the weight of something profound unfolding before the crowd. General Whitaker, his uniform crisp despite the dusty heat of the auction yard, turned sharply toward the auctioneer, whose hands still clutched the microphone in a frozen grip of disbelief. "That vehicle," Whitaker declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade pointing at the weathered Silverado, "is no longer available for public bid. It has been acquired by the Special Operations Warrior Foundation." His words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding, stirring a ripple of confusion through the onlookers. Whispers buzzed. "Who is this guy? What's happening?" As heads turned, searching for answers in the sea of faces, a young aide, sharply dressed in a dark suit, stepped forward, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he handed the portfolio to the auctioneer. The older man fumbled with the pages, his hands shaking as he skimmed the official documents within. His eyes widened, and he nodded jerkily. "Everything appears in order," he stammered, his voice barely carrying over the growing hum of the crowd. The papers confirmed what Whitaker had declared, but to the onlookers, it was like watching a script unfold in a language they didn't yet understand. Just then, the low rumble of another vehicle broke the tension. A truck rolled into the lot, its doors emblazoned with the unmistakable insignia of the Army Special Forces. 4 soldiers in pristine dress uniforms stepped out, their polished boots hitting the gravel with precision. "System. The input you provided was cut off mid-sentence. Based on the context and instructions, I will complete the story naturally, adhering to the guidelines to expand on the emotions and thoughts of the characters while staying faithful to the original content. I will avoid adding new details not present in the original and focus on deepening the internal experiences of the characters. Since this is a new artifact and not an update to a previous one, I will assign a new UUID for the artifact wallet. The content will be wrapped in the required tag with the appropriate attributes." The phone in Tyler's hand trembled slightly, its camera still rolling, capturing a moment that had spiraled far beyond his initial intent. He'd come to the auction yard to record something trivial, maybe even poke fun at the rusty old Silverado on the block. But now he stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and shame. The air around him felt heavier, charged with the weight of something profound unfolding before the crowd. Tyler's chest tightened as he realized his flippant plan to mock the scene was unraveling, replaced by an unfamiliar reverence for the gravity of what he was witnessing. He felt small, his earlier intentions now seeming petty against the unfolding truth. General Whitaker, his uniform crisp despite the dusty heat of the auction yard, turned sharply toward the auctioneer, whose hands still clutched the microphone in a frozen grip of disbelief. Whitaker's presence was commanding, his posture rigid with the weight of years in service. Yet his eyes carried a flicker of empathy, as if he understood the emotional storm about to envelop the crowd. "That vehicle," Whitaker declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, pointing at the weathered Silverado, "is no longer available for public bid. It has been acquired by the Special Operations Warrior Foundation." His words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding, stirring a ripple of confusion through the onlookers. Whispers buzzed. "Who is this guy? What's happening?" As heads turned, searching for answers in the sea of faces. The crowd's curiosity was palpable, a mix of intrigue and unease swirling in their exchanged glances. A young aide, sharply dressed in a dark suit, stepped forward, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he understood the weight of the moment he was facilitating. His face was composed, but his eyes betrayed a quiet respect for the man they were honoring. He handed the portfolio to the auctioneer, who fumbled with the pages, his hands trembling as he skimmed the official documents within. The auctioneer's heart raced. He was used to the rhythm of bids and gavels, not this sudden shift into something far more significant. His eyes widened and he nodded jerkily. "Everything appears in order," he stammered, his voice barely carrying over the growing hum of the crowd. The papers confirmed Whitaker's declaration, but to the onlookers, it was like watching a script unfold in a language they didn't yet understand. The auctioneer felt a pang of inadequacy, as if his role in this moment was too small for its magnitude. Just then, the low rumble of another vehicle broke the tension. A truck rolled into the lot, its doors emblazoned with the unmistakable insignia of the Army Special Forces. The sight sent a jolt through the crowd, a silent acknowledgement that something extraordinary was happening. 4 soldiers in pristine dress uniforms stepped out, their polished boots hitting the gravel with precision. Their faces were stoic, but their eyes held the weight of shared loss and pride. They formed an honor guard near Elias McCall, who stood quietly near the Silverado, his weathered face unreadable, but his hands betraying a faint tremor. Elias's heart was a storm of grief and pride, each emotion crashing against the other. He'd spent years carrying his son's absence like a stone in his chest, and now in this public moment, the wound felt both raw and hallowed. One of the soldiers, a command sergeant major adorned with a chest full of ribbons and medals, carried a small wooden box lined with velvet. His presence commanded respect, but his eyes held a softness, a silent acknowledgement of the shared sacrifice between him and Elias. "Master Sergeant McCall," he began, his voice steady yet laced with reverence, "on behalf of the Secretary of the Army and the United States Special Operations Command, I am honored to present to you the Distinguished Service Cross, awarded posthumously to your son, Captain Nathan McCall, for extraordinary heroism during Operation Crimson Dawn in Fallujah." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as he opened the box to reveal the medal, a bronze cross resting proudly on a bed of blue silk, the second highest military honor a soldier could receive. The sergeant major's throat tightened as he spoke, knowing no medal could fill the void left by Nathan's absence. Elias's face remained stoic, but his hands shook as he reached for the box. His fingers brushed the smooth wood, and for a moment his eyes locked on the medal. Its gleam felt like a tether to Nathan, a son whose laughter still echoed in Elias's quiet moments alone. "He never told me," Elias whispered, his voice so soft it barely carried. The words were a confession, a father's quiet regret for the conversations they'd never had, the pride he'd never voiced while Nathan was alive. The medal was both a treasure and a wound, a symbol of his son's courage that Elias would carry with him always. General Whitaker stepped closer, his voice low but clear, his own heart heavy with the stories of soldiers like Nathan. "The mission was classified until last month," he explained, his tone carrying the gravity of someone who'd seen too many such moments. "Nathan saved his entire unit and 27 Iraqi civilians. He drove a burning fuel truck away from a village, knowing full well it would explode. He knew the cost, Elias, but he did it anyway." Whitaker's words were not just a recounting of facts. They were a tribute to a man who'd chosen others over himself, a man whose courage had burned brighter than the flames that claimed him. Whitaker felt the sting of loss himself, a reminder of the countless soldiers he'd led and lost over the years. Elias's gaze dropped to the medal, his fingers tracing the edges of the box before he closed it with a slow, deliberate motion. 27 lives. The number echoed in his mind, stirring memories of Nathan's work before he deployed, his food program, delivering crates of groceries to struggling families, veterans and widows in their small town. 27 families, the same number Elias had continued to serve in his son's absence, driving the battered Silverado to honor Nathan's legacy. Each delivery had been a quiet act of devotion, a way to keep Nathan's spirit alive in the crates of vegetables and handwritten notes. The coincidence of the number felt like a message from his son, a thread connecting his sacrifice abroad to his compassion at home. The command sergeant major spoke again, his voice cutting through Elias's reverie. "Additionally, the Special Operations Warrior Foundation has secured and outfitted this Silverado to continue Captain McCall's community initiative." Another soldier stepped forward, holding out a set of keys that glinted in the sunlight. The truck, once just a rusted relic on the auction block, now bore a magnetic decal that read, McCall mission, feeding those who served. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of Nathan's heart, his compassion etched into every letter. The soldier handing over the keys felt a swell of pride, knowing the truck would carry forward a legacy of care. A woman in her late 50s pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. Her heart raced with gratitude and sorrow as she faced Elias. "My father was in a wheelchair," she said, her voice trembling but clear, her eyes locked on Elias. "Every Saturday, someone left a crate of vegetables by our door. There was always a note, 'You're not forgotten.' We never knew who it was, but it meant everything to him, to us." Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold in the gratitude and grief that spilled over. The memory of those deliveries had been a lifeline for her father, a reminder that someone cared enough to show up week after week. Others followed, drawn forward by the woman's courage. A retired mechanic, his hands still calloused from years of work, spoke next. "Nathan brought me groceries when I couldn't afford them after my shop closed. He never made me feel small, never acted like it was charity, just said, 'We take care of our own.' I didn't know it was him until now." His voice cracked, and he looked away, blinking hard, his heart heavy with the realization of who'd been his quiet benefactor. The memory of Nathan's kindness was a balm to his pride, a gift he'd never fully appreciated until this moment. One by one they came, veterans, widows, families, each with a story of quiet kindness, of crates left on porches, of notes that reminded them they weren't alone. Each tale was a thread in the tapestry of Nathan's legacy, a testament to a man who'd served not just on the battlefield, but in the heart of his community. Elias stood silently, clutching the wooden box, his heart swelling with pride, yet aching with the absence of his son. He'd always known Nathan was special, but hearing these stories, seeing the faces of those he'd touched, it was almost too much to bear. Each voice added weight to the box in his hands, a reminder of the son who'd given everything. Tyler, standing alone at the edge of the crowd, felt the weight of his phone in his hand. What had started as a fleeting moment to capture for likes or laughs had transformed into something sacred. He kept recording, not for mockery now, but to preserve this moment, this truth. The Silverado stood unmoved, yet it was no longer just a truck. It was a monument, a symbol of sacrifice and service, of a young man's heart that had reached across continents in years to touch lives. The decal's words, McCall mission, feeding those who served, gleamed in the sunlight, a beacon of dignity, kindness, and quiet power that this town had nearly forgotten. Tyler's throat tightened as he realized he'd stumbled into a lesson he'd carry forever. Some moments were too big for fleeting posts, too profound for ridicule. As the crowd drew closer to Elias, offering words of gratitude and shared grief, Tyler lowered his phone. His heart was heavy with a newfound respect, a recognition that he'd witnessed something eternal. The Silverado, once just a battered auction item, now stood as a testament to a hero's legacy, its presence a quiet reminder of dignity and sacrifice. The stories shared, the metal presented, the truck repurposed, all of it wove together to form a moment Tyler knew he'd never forget. A moment that had shifted something deep within him. In a small town where everyone thought they knew each other's stories, a quiet truth unraveled, woven from the lives of people touched by a man whose compassion had gone unnoticed for years. A veteran who had served in Korea spoke first, his voice steady but thick with gratitude. He remembered Elias McCall, the man who showed up at his doorstep with a crate of vegetables, never asking for thanks, only offering a nod and a quiet smile. The veteran's hands trembled as he spoke, his mind drifting to those lonely evenings when the weight of his past seemed unbearable. Those deliveries weren't just food, they were a lifeline, a reminder that someone cared, even if he never knew why. Then came a widow, her voice soft but piercing, a former nurse who had spent her life tending to others but found herself alone after her husband's passing. She recalled the first time Elias appeared, his weathered hands holding out a basket of tomatoes and zucchini. She had tried to pay him, but he refused, his eyes kind but firm. "Just pass it on someday," he'd said. In her quiet apartment, where the silence often felt suffocating, those visits became a ritual she clung to. Each knock at the door stirred a warmth in her chest, a fleeting moment where she felt seen. She hadn't known Elias was carrying the memory of his son Nathan, a soldier lost in a distant war, but she sensed something deeper in his silence, a purpose that went beyond charity. A young man stepped forward next, his voice hesitant, eyes fixed on the ground. He was barely a teenager when Elias visited his family years ago, but the memory was vivid. Elias standing on their porch, sun-baked and unassuming, handing over a crate of fresh produce with a smile that felt like a secret shared. The boy hadn't understood then, but now as a young adult, he saw it clearly. Those tomatoes weren't just food. They were a bridge connecting a grieving father to a community that never knew the depth of his loss. Each story layered onto the last, painting a portrait of a man who had built a quiet network of care, driven by the legacy of a son he'd never see again. Tyler, a brash young man who had mocked Elias earlier that day, stood apart from the crowd, his usual confidence shattered. His laughter had been the loudest when he and his friends poked fun at Elias's worn boots and beat-up Silverado, calling him a relic, a nobody. Now his chest felt tight, his throat knotted with shame. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes, least of all Elias's. His mother appeared beside him, her face streaked with tears. She reached for his hand, her voice trembling as she addressed Elias. "Mr. McCall," she began, "I had no idea. My father, he passed last year, but every Saturday he waited for your knock. He'd sit by the window watching the road, knowing you'd come. Those meals kept him going. He never felt forgotten." Her words broke and she squeezed Tyler's hand tighter, as if anchoring herself to the moment. Elias's face softened, his eyes searching hers. "That was your father?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her lips quivering. "He wouldn't let us thank you. Said the man who brought the food didn't want praise, just to be remembered." For the first time that day, Tyler felt the weight of his own ignorance. His voice cracked as he stepped forward, barely audible. "I was wrong, sir," he muttered. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you were doing." The words felt inadequate, a feeble attempt to undo the hurt he'd caused. Elias looked at him, not with anger, but with a gentle understanding that cut deeper than any reprimand. "No one ever does," he said softly. "That's how judgment works. We make up our minds without the full story." Tyler's head dropped, his cheeks burning with regret, but Elias placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Now you know, son." The following Sunday, before the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Elias's Silverado rumbled out of the McCall farm, its bed loaded with crates of fresh produce. But this time, Elias wasn't alone. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, clutching a crate of squash and tomatoes, his knuckles white from nerves. He hadn't been invited, he'd simply shown up, unable to shake the guilt that had kept him awake all week. Elias didn't question his presence, only handed him a crate and nodded toward the truck. The drive was quiet, but for Tyler, it was deafening. He replayed his mocking words, each one a barb that now pierced his own heart. Yet as they made their first delivery, watching an elderly woman's face light up at the sight of fresh vegetables, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he felt part of something bigger than himself. Word of Elias's mission spread and soon others joined. A handful of high school students, inspired by the story, showed up with eager hands and open hearts. A couple of young veterans who understood the weight of loss brought their own crates to fill. Even some of the families Elias had quietly served began to volunteer, wanting to repay the kindness that had carried them through hard times. What started as a solitary act of remembrance grew into a movement, rooted in the memory of Nathan McCall, a soldier whose life had ended too soon, but whose legacy lived on through his father's hands. The Silverado was upgraded with insulated storage to keep the produce fresh. New crates were built, sturdier and larger to meet the growing demand. The mission expanded to neighboring counties, fueled by donations from strangers who had never met Nathan, but felt connected to him through the stories of Elias's work. The local newspaper published a feature, calling it the McCall Mission, from battlefield to backyard. Reporters tried to interview Elias, but he waved them off. "This isn't about me," he'd say, his voice firm but kind. "It's about showing up, quietly, faithfully, whether anyone notices or not." Cameras followed him, but he always turned away, his figure a blur in motion or a shadow in the background of every photo. He never wore Nathan's medal, never spoke of the general who had honored his son, never mentioned the convoy that had taken Nathan's life. The story spread anyway, carried by those who had been touched by his quiet devotion. Tyler, once the loudest skeptic, became the mission's most dedicated volunteer. He learned to plant, harvest, pack, and deliver, not out of obligation but out of a newfound purpose. His old friends barely recognized him, his once carefree attitude replaced by a quiet resolve. One day as they watched him load crates into the Silverado, one of them asked, "What changed you, man?" Tyler paused, his hand resting on the truck's faded decal, a simple tribute to Nathan. He didn't answer right away, just pointed to the words etched there. "That man fed a town while we laughed at his boots," he said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. Elias McCall never sought recognition. He never wore his own medals, never accepted invitations to be honored, never agreed to a single television interview. He simply returned to work. Every Sunday morning, the familiar rumble of the Silverado's engine echoed down the gravel path, a comforting promise to those who had come to rely on its arrival. But now it wasn't just Elias behind the wheel. Sometimes it was Tyler, his hands steady as he navigated the familiar routes. Sometimes it was a high school volunteer, their laughter mingling with the hum of the engine. Sometimes it was a veteran, their eyes reflecting a quiet understanding of the mission's deeper meaning. Together, they carried on what Elias had started, a legacy of compassion that grew stronger with every crate delivered, every door knocked, every life touched. Elias McCall was a man of quiet resolve, a father whose heart carried the weight of a promise made to a son who would never return. He didn't lead with grand gestures or loud proclamations. Instead, he showed the way with a steady hand, a bowed head, and the kind of work that spoke louder than any speech ever could. For Elias, the mission wasn't about fame or accolades. Those were fleeting things, as insubstantial as morning mist. "Recognition doesn't grow tomatoes," he'd say with a soft chuckle, his eyes crinkling with the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough of life to know what truly mattered. "It doesn't feed old veterans or fill empty bellies, work does." And so he worked, day after day, mile after mile. He poured himself into keeping his word, honoring his fallen son with every crate of vegetables packed, every delivery made to those who needed it most. What began as one man's solemn vow in a small corner of the county blossomed into something far greater, a movement that seemed to take root in the hearts of those around him, like seeds scattered on fertile ground. As weeks stretched into months, the McCall mission grew beyond a simple tribute. It became a lifeline, a testament to the power of quiet, consistent action. Churches opened their basements, offering storage space for the crates of fresh produce Elias and his volunteers tirelessly gathered. Retired farmers, their hands still calloused from decades of tending the earth, donated plots of land to grow more food. Local businesses, moved by the sight of Elias's weathered Silverado crisscrossing the county, pitched in with fuel crates and even new tires to keep the old truck rolling. Each contribution was a thread in a tapestry of community, woven together by a shared sense of purpose. For Elias, though, the growth of the mission wasn't a point of pride. It was just what needed to be done. His heart, heavy with grief, yet buoyed by duty, beat steadily with the rhythm of his promise. He didn't see himself as the center of it all, though others did. To him, every volunteer, every donor, every person who showed up was part of something bigger than any one man. He felt a quiet pride, not in himself, but in the people around him. He saw the way their eyes lit up when they handed a crate of food to a veteran who'd known too many hungry nights, or when they listened, rapt, to stories of courage and sacrifice that no history book could ever capture. Elias carried his son's memory in every step, but he also carried the weight of those stories, those lives, in the hope that his work might ease their burdens, even just a little. The movement spread like wildfire, leaping from the county to the state, touching hearts that had never known the quiet pain of a veteran's empty pantry or the sting of a forgotten promise. Young people, some barely out of high school, who had never spoken to a veteran before, now spent their weekends hauling crates, their hands growing strong and their hearts growing full. They learned about food insecurity, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality for too many. They sat at folding tables in community centers, listening to men and women whose eyes carried the weight of wars fought long ago, their voices weaving tales of brotherhood, loss, and resilience. For these young volunteers, the mission was more than a task. It was a bridge. A bridge across generations, across divides of time and experience, built one delivery, one conversation, one shared moment at a time. They began to understand the cost of freedom, the value of service, and the quiet dignity of showing up for someone else. Elias remained unchanged by the growing attention. He was the same man he'd always been, humble, steady, unwavering. His days began before dawn, his boots crunching on gravel as he loaded his truck, his mind focused not on what he'd accomplished, but on what still needed doing. He didn't seek the spotlight. In fact, he shied away from it, his broad shoulders hunching slightly when people tried to praise him. When a reporter finally tracked him down at a bustling farmer's market, her microphone thrust forward like a challenge. She asked, "Do you consider yourself a hero, Mr. McCall?" Elias paused, his hand stilling on a crate of tomatoes, and let out a low, warm chuckle that seemed to rise from deep within his chest. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but soft, like the wind rustling through a field. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a father keeping a promise." He glanced over at the volunteers nearby, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they packed boxes with care. "The world's full of heroes," he added, his eyes softening with a mix of pride and humility. "They're just too busy helping to call themselves that." As the camera pulled back from Elias, from the market alive with purpose, from the crates stacked high with hope, it captured something profound. Dignity doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, week after week, in the steady rhythm of a man driving his truck down dusty roads to deliver food to those who need it most. In a world that races forward, where value is often measured by likes, shares, and fleeting moments of attention, Elias McCall's story stood as a quiet rebellion. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to post about his work or chase recognition. His actions, simple, deliberate, relentless, spoke for him. They echoed a time when neighbors knew each other's names, when a promise was a bond forged in steel, when service wasn't a performance but a sacred duty. Elias honored his son's legacy not with words, but with the sweat of his brow, the miles on his odometer, and the weight of every crate he carried. His story was a reminder, a call to a generation that still remembers the power of community, of showing up without being asked, of doing the right thing because it's right. In a time fractured by division, where voices clash and tempers flare, Elias's quiet kindness offered a different path. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was revolutionary in its simplicity. It asked us to look at the people around us, really look, and to act with purpose, with compassion, with the kind of steadfast commitment that changes lives one delivery at a time. Elias McCall didn't set out to change the world. He set out to keep a promise. And in doing so, he showed us all what it means to live with quiet purpose, to serve without seeking reward, and to shine without ever needing a spotlight.